Okay, welcome everybody. So we're gonna thank you so much, Bert, for making this happen. It's always a pleasure to have an opportunity to learn together with this crew. James, good to see you. And Robert, I'll just say every time you take your hands off the wheels, even if it's a self-driving Tesla, it still makes me nervous. So be safe. And it's wonderful to have an opportunity to learn together. So our topic for the next 3 weeks is going to be the conversion of babies, of minors. Does everybody have, I sent an email last night with the source material. Does everybody have access to that material?
We didn't have a chance yet.
Okay, as long as you've seen it, you have access to it, because we're going to learn sources.
Yes.
I prefer to not share a screen if I can avoid it. That way we can all see each other a little bit more easily. So let me start with a few words of introduction about kind of general issues when it comes to converting minors, and then some specific cases in which it comes up, and then we'll go into the sources. So there are kind of, in a general sense, 3 different approaches to the conversion of minors. And it's almost all kind of done in relationship to or in echo of the conversion of an adult, which we're not going to deal with because it would take us too long. But the 3 different positions that are out there amongst contemporary poskim are: number 1, the conversion of minors basically the same for the purposes of the family as it is for the conversion of an adult, which means that if you think that when an adult converts, they have to be fully shomer Shabbat and fully shomer kashrut and be davening in an Orthodox synagogue and if that's your assumption about the conversion of an adult, there are many who would take it for granted that that is the same expectation of the family into which this minor will be converted. So option number 1, it's kind of the most stringent option, is that the standards that we apply to the family system into which this child is converted is the same as you would for an adult, and that those standards include full shmirat mitzvot, full observance of mitzvot, as much as one is possible. That's option number 1. Option number 2, moving a little bit more flexible or lenient, is to say we want to make sure that this child grows up in an environment in which they will have a Jewishly engaged family and a reasonably connected Jewish community. And we want them to understand what does Shabbat and Kashrut look like. And we want the family system to be sort of productive and conducive to those options. But it's not necessarily the case that the family has to be fully observant according to every jot and tittle. That's kind of a middle position. The third position is to say, we just think it's good for people to be Jews, to have the opportunity to perform mitzvot, and therefore it doesn't really matter what the framework or the Jewish framework of that family looks like. And any setting would, in theory, be okay, regardless of the parents' shmirat mitzvot. So we have those 3, let's call them A, B, and C. A is full shmirat mitzvot for the family. B is kind of seriously Jewishly engaged for the family. And C is that the family almost doesn't matter. We just think it's good to be Jewish. All 3 options exist in the kind of contemporary halachic landscape. And part of what I'm going to try to show is how those things emerge from the Gemara that we'll look at today. Next week, we're going to look at medieval commentators. In the 3rd session, we're going to look at kind of contemporary writers, contemporary poskim. But along the way, I'm going to try to show you how the different kind of foundational texts can be used to make different kinds of arguments. And all 3 are sort of reasonable positions. And so one of the challenges always is that there are 3 different options. How does each option relate to the other? So that's what we'll get to at the very, very end. So that's kind of the broad landscape of where we're going. That's kind of introductory comment number 1. Introductory comment number 2 is, what are the cases in which people are converting minors? So let's start with 2 Jewish parents, a mother and a father, who are adopting a child who is not Jewish. So that's kind of the standard case in which this comes up. Certainly in pre the year 2000, that's the standard case. So is the expectation that the parents will be fully shomer mitzvot? Let's say a couple can't have children for one reason or another, and they want to adopt. Or let's say a couple has children, and now they have the opportunity to adopt a child or foster a child. What does that adoption or fostering ultimately look like? What do we expect of a child who will be converted into a Jewish family. That's the standard case. What happens if the family is an engaged Jewish family? They want to send their kids to Jewish day school, but they're not fully Shomer Shabbos. Can you convert a child into that setting? Or what happens when a non-religious couple want their child to be Jewish, but isn't religious, is not interested or committed to Shabbat in any meaningful way? Maybe they make Kiddush sometimes on Friday night, but maybe they don't. What are the possibilities given two Jewish parents, man and a woman? That's that's kind of standard case number one, which is what most of the poskim are dealing with. That is to say, two Jewish parents trying to figure out what do we require of those parents in order to ultimately convert a child into that family system. Possibility number two could be one Jewish parent, let's say the father is Jewish, the mother is not. They have a child, but the mother doesn't want to convert. Baby goes according to the mother. Can you convert a child into a family system in which the mother is not Jewish, the father is Jewish? And let's say, for argument's sake, fully Shomer Shabbos home, fully Shomer Kashrut home, the mother is not engaged in another religion, she's just not interested in being Jewish. So what about that kind of a situation where we have one where the mother is not Jewish? Or a somewhat unusual case, what if two non-Jews want to convert their child to be Jewish? We'll see when we get the last session, we'll look at a tshuva by Rav Herzog, who basically says that's okay. It's hard for me to imagine being involved in that, but two non-Jews come and say, we don't want to convert, but we think that Judaism is the true religion. I want our children to be Jewish. Can this couple convert, these non-Jews convert their child? It's like a fascinating thought experiment. Yeah, go ahead, Bert.
I assume I hope that you're going to also get, you were talking just about male and female. We're talking about female and female as well, and male and male adoption.
Well, slowly, we'll get there in a second.
You'll get there. I understand. Okay, so I just wanted to be sure. That's where one of the things you were heading towards.
Of course. So if they're two non-Jews want to convert their parents, or more likely or more common, let's say a whole family wants to convert. Two non-Jewish parents with 3 kids who aren't Jewish. A whole family wants to go together. How does that work? And in all of those cases, the kind of fundamental question is, what's the mechanism that allows this child to become Jewish if the kid's a minor? Because that's going to be the deep question, or the sort of fundamental halachic question. That's kind of assuming a man and a woman as the parents. What happens when you have a single dad who wants to adopt, or 2 dads who want to adopt? How does that work? If the 2 dads are doing surrogacy, and the donor egg and the host are neither of them are Jewish, such that the maternal DNA is all non-Jewish, so that the child is halachically requires a conversion. What about that? And we have to now ask the same set of questions. If the 2 dads are fully Shomer Shabbos and Kashrut and davening and et cetera, what kind of answer might you give there? What if the 2 dads are engaged in Jewish life, but aren't particularly from? What if they're not interested in Jewish life at all, but they want to have their child be Jewish? So we're going to have to figure that out. It's like, does the fact that it's 2 men living together change anything? Or is it just another instantiation of the same set of questions? Typically with 2 moms, it's a Jewish DNA, so it doesn't come up as much, but in theory, 2 moms could adopt, and then you have the same set of questions. Okay, those are kind of the broad possibilities in halacha and the cases in real time. There's a difference between converting like a newborn baby, converting a 10-year-old or a 9-year-old, and converting an 11.5-year-old girl or a 12.5-year-old boy. And once the child is 11 or 12 and or 12 or 13 has reached their bar bat mitzvah, then we're in a whole different category of converting a halachic adult. So people understand when you convert a baby, the baby has to go fully under the water. It is an unusual parenting moment where you typically don't put your child's head under the water, but the baby has to be fully immersed. The babies do quite fine. And if it's a boy, he would also need either a mila, a full circumcision if he hadn't yet had it, or a hatafat dam, a kind of symbolic removal of a small amount of blood. So those are the kind of rituals. We'll talk a little bit about that perhaps at the very end. But now I want to kind of revert back to the original sources. Any other before we look inside the sources, are there abstract questions or particular cases or anything that anybody has in mind before we start kind of working through the source material? Okay, so let's take a look at page number 1. I tried to get everything here in Hebrew and English. I'm going to read the Hebrew as we go and kind of slowly translate line by line. You'll see the English below. The English for the Mishnayot or the Gemarot comes off of Sefaria. It's the Steinsaltz translation. With Sefaria, the way Sefaria works, that the bold letters are the sort of more direct or literal translation. The non-bolded letters is their interpolation to help it to read like a normal sentence. I just listened to a fascinating podcast with the man who founded Sefaria by the name of Josh Foer called 1840. If anybody wants to check it out, it's interesting to sort of hear him talk about why he created Sefaria, what inspired him, and how it operates and how they think about Jewish texts and what's the goal of Sefaria. It is a very useful tool with some limitations, but an extraordinarily useful tool of democratizing Jewish learning. Okay, says the Mishnah in Masechet Ketubot regarding a set of particular type of women. Now, there's going to be some stuff here which is a little bit unpleasant, and we're going to say some unkind things, and I'll name those things. But my goal here is not to sort of apologize for the rabbis. But there's stuff that they assume about women which is going to be unpleasant. If we want to talk about sort of problematic texts in the history of Halacha, that would be a whole nother set of shiurim. But the following assumption is very important. The following detail is very important. When a woman gets married, she receives a certain amount of money as part of her commitment if the couple were to get divorced, and that amount of money is 200 zuzim. Let's call it $200. And if she is not a virgin, the number gets cut in half, and she only gets $100. So there is an assumption that a woman who is a virgin is of greater monetary value, and a woman who is not a virgin is of lesser monetary value, 200 versus 100. So what the Mishnah is going to deal with here is women who are, for one reason or another, presumed to have had intercourse and therefore no longer get a full ketubah of 200. And what about if there are exceptions to that rule? Okay, it's a complicated rule. We could talk about writing ketubot and what that looks like today in another session. So this Mishnah towards the first half, the very beginning actually of Masechet Ketubot, is dealing with 3 different types of women: a gioret, a shvuya, and a shivcha. Talking about a convert, a woman who converts; a shvuya, a woman who had been taken as a captive; and a maidservant, a type of a slave. And each of these women, shenifdu, shenitgairu, veshenishtachreru, who were converted, who were redeemed, who were sort of freed as slaves. So it's important to note the following: if a Jew went and purchased a slave from the slave market, a couple of weeks ago I was in Rome and I saw a 2,000-year-old slave market, which is actually pretty cool. And the chances are that people from the time of the Mishnah went to Rome and acquired slaves, which is horrible to think about, but was normal in the ancient world. So if a Jewish owner went and bought a non-Jew from the slave market, when that non-Jewish slave was now living in the Jewish home, the person underwent a quasi kind of conversion. And that non-Jewish slave living inside a Jewish home had to keep Shabbat, had to keep kosher, and had to keep most of the mitzvot. And in fact, to become a slave, they were immersed in the mikveh. Then if they were manumitted, right, if they were emancipated and freed, that person now is a full Jew. Like they're a full-on Jewish person, Jewish free person. So that the example or the model of acquiring a non-Jewish slave is actually one of the ways in which a non-Jew can be made Jewish against their will. Thank God we don't have this anymore. Slavery is no longer an option for any number of reasons. And the penalties are the same if they broke Shabbat. Yeah, in theory, they would be stoned. Same set of rules. They basically have all the same obligations in mitzvot, except they don't have to fulfill positive time-out commandments. Sort of like a woman. Okay? So they're sort of quasi-Jews in that regard. And if they're freed, they're now full Jews. A shvuya, a woman who's taken captive, is obviously, and the assumption is that non-Jews are loose in their behaviors, and therefore a slave who was acquired from the slave market is presumed to have had relationships and is no longer a virgin. A shvuya, a woman who was taken captive, lo aleinu, is assumed to have, God forbid, been raped. And that woman also is not considered a virgin. Gioret, a woman who converted, also, a woman who converts as an adult is presumed to have had relations before she converted. The rabbis just assumed that non-Jews were licentious in their behaviors. However, says the Mishnah, that's all if this happened when these women were adults. What happens if a woman who converted or who was redeemed or who was emancipated, line 3 of the Mishnah in the Hebrew, pchutot mibnot shalosh shanim b'yom echad, under the age of 3, which means to say one of two things. Either the assumption is that they were not engaged in sexual behavior, or even more absurd or more painful to imagine, even if a 2-year-old girl had been raped, whatever that means in their minds, that's not considered to be halachic intercourse. So that if a non-Jew converts at the age of 2 or as a newborn baby, that person who converts now as a Jew who's a 1.5-year-old, her ketubah, when she gets married, remains at 200. She marries as a halachic virgin, as opposed to if she would have converted as an adult. Okay, so the assumption of this Mishnah is that these 3 women, if this happened, if she was taken captive or freed as a slave or converted under the age of 3, they're halachically considered to be virgins and still get a ketubah of 200, and therefore, and in theory, their husbands can make a claim that they thought they were going to be virgins. They're not. Hello, Livia, welcome. Does everybody have the source sheets? Everybody here have source sheets? No, so you know what I'm going to do, Olivia? I'm going to put a link into the chat. Just give me 1 second with the Google Doc. Let me just change my accessibilities things here. Anyone with the link, copy link in the chat. Here we go. Give me 1 second. Paste. Okay, if anybody doesn't have the sources, I apologize. But now there's a Google Doc in there. So the Mishnah just introduces this concept, very important concept, but raises a very strange question. What is the Mishnah imagining when it's talking about a 2-year-old girl who converts, or boy? Meaning, what's the case? Are we talking about a child walking into the Beit Din? Are we talking about a child found in the shuk? Is the child being adopted? Where are the parents? Like, what's actually going on in this case remains unclear, and we're not going to have to answer that question until next week. Which is to say, like, let's say the rabbis found a baby in the shuk, and they don't know who's, and that baby has a cross on it, or whatever. We know that the baby's not Jewish. Could you just convert a child against the child's will, against the parent's will? Is that even possible? And that begins to raise the 2 kind of conceptual questions, which I kind of outlined on the next page, of that the Gemara itself is going to deal with. We're going to look at basically one passage of Gemara today, broken up into small little sections. But the 2 sort of big conceptual questions are, number 1, what's the mechanism that allows a child to convert? We assume that whatever we think Kabbalat HaMitzvot is for an adult, whatever that looks like, it still requires intellect or intention and the expression of a halachic will. And if a child is 2 years old or 10 years old, they don't have halachic da'at, intellect. So how can a child convert? What's allowing this child to actually become Jewish? Whose intellect is standing in for the fact that the child doesn't have halachic da'at, halachic intellect? That's question number 1 that the Gemara will deal with. Question number 2 is, when an adult converts and then backslides, that's just a Jew who is sinning. It is true that today there is this bizarre notion that conversions can be retroactively annulled. I believe that's basically rabbinic malpractice and doesn't exist in halacha. That's for another set of shiurim. But if this child converts before their bar or bat mitzvah, and then when they're 11 or 12, they're not really interested in Jewish life, and they never show a commitment to any type of observance, is it possible that their conversion is somehow more contingent because they were fundamentally converted against their own will? There might have been somebody else's will in the picture, but they never expressed or were never able to express their own interest, desire, intellect to become Jews. Okay, so question number one is, what's the mechanism? Question number two is, do we consider the conversion of a minor to be somehow more contingent because in the end of the day, they only converted with someone else's intellect allowing this process to go forward? Okay, those are our two questions. That's where the Gemara is going to go. On page number 3 of the source sheet is sort of a picture of the Vilna Shas. The reason why I gave this to you was really just to show you that we're only doing like, I don't know, 15, 20 lines of Gemara, and we're going to do them very, very slowly and carefully, because these lines are basically almost everything that the Gemara has to say about the conversion of a minor. And you see there's number 1, the statement of Rav Huna, and this number 2, the statement of Rav Yosef. Those two statements are really going to deal with number 1, the mechanism, and 2, the contingency. Okay, so I just wanted to give you a sense visually that we're actually not going to be covering so much ground today, but we're going to do it slowly, meticulously, and carefully, so that when we get to the Rishonim, to the medieval commentators next week, you will have already appreciated the kind of questions that they're going to be answering and what's going on. Okay? Questions before I move forward? Questions about the Mishnah, about what I've said so far? Everybody doing okay?
Thank God.
Judy, is that a question or is that just a...
No, oh, yes, I agree. Everything's good.
Everything's good. Wonderful. Thank you. It's always hard to teach on Zoom because I can't really read your body language if you're awake or not. So it's good to have your voices in the room. Okay, so I'm going to go to page 4. Also my sources are on my screen to my left. If I'm looking over here, I don't mean to look away from you all. I'm just peeking at my sources. So the first thing that we're going to deal with is this question of mechanism. Rav Huna, who is an early Amora, he's a student of Rav, who was a student of the Tanaim of the Mishnah. So we're talking about early on in the history of the Gemara, meaning the Mishnah itself must be aware of the concept of a child converting, because the Mishnah talks about this girl who converted at the age of 3. It never tells us how that happens. Rav Huna, early on, then says, Amar Rav Huna ger katan, a minor who converts, not to be lino to al dat beitin. We convert him, we immerse him through the authority of the court. So his statement is addressing the question that I kind of laid out, which is, how can a child convert? They don't have their own intellect. So what's the da'at that's standing in is the da'at or intellect of the court itself. Yeah, go ahead, Bert.
I assume that means that the parents bring, in most cases, that the parents bring the kid to the Bezdin, because, particularly if it's, a young kid, they're not going to show up themselves. I mean, what's the interplay?
So we're going to get to the question of what the parents want in just a moment, but I'll just say for now that not all Rishonim assume that the parents are involved. Maybe it's a kid found in the shuk. Maybe it's a kid that shows up by themselves. And what then would it mean if 2 non-Jewish parents show up and want to convert the kid, but the parents themselves don't want to convert? I mean, there's all sorts of things that are left unclear by this statement. All that's clarified is we have a problem. A kid can't do any mitzvah, right? A child does not have the ability to express their own halachic will. So how can a kid become Jewish? So the answer that Rav Huna gives me is that it's through the authority of the Beit Din. Now, yeah, James?
This Gemara going on this Mishnah that we read?
Yeah, it's directly commenting on the Mishnah.
So the Mishnah is talking about a Gioret and Rav Huna is talking about a Ger.
Correct. So it's interesting, the gender there. The Mishnah is talking about Gioret because it's talking about the Ketubah. Rav Huna is talking about ger. I assume he doesn't mean specifically a gendered word there. I assume he just means any convert. But that is a good point. We'll have the question of the gender of the parent actually becomes very interesting. Rashi makes a distinction between what happens if the mother as opposed to the father, but the gender of the child seems to be irrelevant. But it's a good point.
So then wouldn't we assume it's talking about a slave?
Well, there's a separate sugya that deals with slaves.
But the mission is talking about slaves mostly. Slaves are maidservants.
Yeah. Yeah, but we don't usually call the process of freeing a slave is a different. It's not called ger. It is a halachic convert, but it's a different thing, a different category. Judy, was that a question?
Yeah, another question. Yes, just a sociological question. You talk about adoption. In ancient times, when people are trying just to survive, did they have the leisure to take on another member of the family to feed it and take care of, et cetera, et cetera?
There were wealthy people, and there were wealthy
Adopt in general, and a later invention or concept.
There were wealthy Jews who could afford to acquire slaves could probably also afford to adopt.
Okay, right.
In theory, a possibility. How it works is not obvious, but what part of what this does by saying al dat beit din is that it shifts from the intellect of the child to the presence and role and authority of the beit din. And now I'm going to just open a parentheses for a second, because this now leads to the politicization of who thinks they're an appropriate beit din. Meaning, a lot of the contemporary debates about conversion have nothing to do with halacha, but have to do with, and not really about who is a Jew, but who is a rabbi. Meaning, in the end of the day, if this whole thing is based on the authority of the beit din, who's the converting body, so then if I do a beit din and somebody to my right thinks I'm treif, so then the conversion is useless. And it raises all of the problems of the contemporary conversion crisis, which is that rabbis don't trust each other and don't respect each other, both within the denomination boundaries and certainly going across denominational boundaries. So on the one hand, saying it's the authority of the beit din makes a lot of sense, because you need somebody's authority in the mix. On the other hand, it creates a problem that now, depending on which beit din is involved, you have to sort of figure out like who's going to accept it. And the Israeli chief rabbinate is going to always make a problem in that regard. Okay, let's close that parenthesis. I'm going to try to avoid talking about the politics of conversion, at least until the last session, because I might end up saying things that I shouldn't say, and it's going to be recorded, and somebody's going to quote me back to me, and then I'm going to get in trouble. If I need to, I might pause the recording. So Rav Huna says you can convert a child through the authority of the beit din. The Gemara then asks, "My Kamash Malan, what are you teaching me? That's not a new fact, because that seems to just be teaching me dezechutulo v'zachin la'adam shelo b'fanav." What that seems to be saying is that it's good to be a Jew. It's a zechut, it's a merit, and you're allowed to give somebody a merit even without their acquiescence. I can sort of give you a gift even if you're not there. There's a general concept in halacha of zachin la'adam shelo b'fanav. I can say I want to give Bert a gift of $1 million, but I can't say I'm going to take $150 from James. If James isn't in the room, he could give me the money, but I can't take something from somebody in their absence, but I can give somebody a gift in their absence. So the Gemara's bother, why are you telling me this, Rav Huna? I already know this principle. Tanina, it's already been taught explicitly in a Mishnah in Masechet Eruvin, that zachin la'adam shelo b'fanav ein chavin la'adam shelo b'fanav. So why are you telling me, Rav Huna, that the beit din can do this? Of course the beit din can do this. It should be obvious, and I already know this because it's a zechut. It's a merit. It's a good thing to be a Jew. So says the Gemara, why might it not necessarily be a good thing to be a Jew. Mahu de tema, you might have thought, goy behefkera nichale, a non-Jew enjoys their hefker life, enjoys the licentiousness, the licentious world or fantasy that Chazal had of non-Jews. The Hakaimalan, the Eved, Vadai behefkera nichale, because we hold that slaves like their licentious lifestyle. So in the rabbi's mind, the lives of slaves and non-Jews was sort of like the basement of Downton Abbey, meaning everybody was there was like all these affairs going on in the rabbi's minds, which may or may not have been true. But what the Gemara is asking is, maybe for a non-Jew to convert isn't a great thing, because now they can't do all the things they used to do, whether that was sort of improper sexual behavior or just food or Shabbos. So you might think, Mahu de Tema, you might think that maybe a non-Jew doesn't want to be Jewish because it's hard to be a Jew. We got to be tzvot. So Kamash Malan, when is it that we say it's hard to convert because you would have enjoyed your kind of non-Jewish lifestyle? Hani Mili Gadol. That's talking about an adult. The ta'am the Yisur has already tasted the taste of that which is prohibited. Here, I think ta'am the Yisura has both food implications as well as sexual implications. Aval katam, when we're talking about a minor who we hope at the age of 2.5 is not engaged in those kind of behaviors, zechutulo, it is meritorious. It's good to be a Jew. Now, one of the things we're going to see when we fast forward a little bit in the third session is that depending upon how you think about the lives of non-Jews or the potential merit of being a non-Jew, you might have a different approach to converting. Meaning, from my perspective, if a person is a well-behaved non-Jew, they're going to go to Olam Haba, they can live a good life, they're going to be good people, and they could still eat cheeseburgers, let's say. Meaning, in my mind, I don't believe that there is something essentially or ontologically better about being Jewish. I like being Jewish, but it's not my assumption that Jews are fundamentally better than non-Jews. So if you believe that, therefore, what is the zechut of being Jewish if it's not fundamentally better? Or to put it differently, if you are a person who believes that Jews are better than non-Jews, which is a piece of our Misorah, and there is a piece of our tradition that sometimes gets more press than I would like, that views Jews as fundamentally better than non-Jews. And if you think that, so zechut hulo, it's a merit for this person to become Jewish, is because now they have a Jewish neshama somehow. The neshama comes in at the mikvah, and they're fundamentally better than they were before because now they're Jewish. So if you have a more liberal approach to the kind of relative status of Jews and non-Jews, the zechut might dafka mean being shomer Shabbat and shomer kashrut and fulfilling mitzvot. If, however, you have a more, I don't know what the right word is, right-wing approach to the relative status of Jews and non-Jews, and you think it's fundamentally better to be Jewish whether or not you're shomer Shabbos, so you might think, just let's convert everybody, because then they're just better to be a Jews. It's just better sort of ontologically, fundamentally, at some fundamental neshama level, they'll have all these benefits, even if they're breaking Shabbos and they're breaking kashrut. Because there's an interesting flip that we're going to see over time. There is the world of Chabad doesn't usually get involved with conversions because the sort of first Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Baal HaTanya, Rav Shneur Zalman of Liadi, really had a very particular view of the Jewish neshama as better, as higher than the non-Jewish neshama. So Chabadnikim typically aren't involved in conversions. They'll sort of farm them out to a local Orthodox rabbi. Okay, so here is the fundamental question that all the poskim are going to ask is, in this particular circumstance, can you consider converting the child to be a zechut? Is it a merit? And that comes down to, well, are they going to be shomer Shabbos? Because if we're going to convert a kid and then they're not going to be shomer Shabbos, they're just going to have to be punished from a Kadosh Baruch Hu's perspective. That's not such a good zechut. It's a chov. It's actually a demerit, because now we're giving them obligations they didn't have before. But if you're going to convert a kid, it's a reasonable chance they're going to be raised in a Shomer Shabbos environment, and that Bezrat Hashem they'll choose ultimately to be Shomer Shabbos. So then, okay, then it's a zechut, or at least the potential zechut. That's the way in which the sort of my first point of A, B, C gets sort of metabolized. If you're converting into a frum family, let's say your chances are better that you're going to be a frum Jew. If you're converting to a Jewishly engaged family, it could be a zechut, but maybe not. If you're converting into a family that's not Shomer Shabbos at all, you have to come up with some other way to conceptualize what's going on there, because maybe it's not really so meritorious if they're going to be violating halacha on a regular basis.
Question.
Yeah.
Yeah, does the rabbi or the beit din there have any kind of liability or any, causal relationship, or is anything on them that they're responsible that the converted child that they converted stays b'nei or benot mitzvah?
So I would say not technically, meaning halachically, according to the law, there's no formal, you're not on the hook. That being said, a good rabbi that's their job, is to maintain a connection with the child, with the family, so that ultimately the kid, is connected to the Jewish community in some meaningful way. That's the job. That's like the job description. It's not a halachic requirement.
Okay,
Per se.
yeah, thank you.
Okay, one more step within Rav Huna. The Gemara says, Lema Misayeh. The phrase Lema Misayeh is when the Gemara introduces something with Lema, it is always going to reject it. It's what we call a havamina. You might think this, no that. So Lema Misayeh, maybe our Mishnah should be brought as a support to Rav Huna. Lema Misayeh, our Mishnah, Hagioret v'Ashvuya v'Ashivcha sheniftu v'shenitgayu v'shishtacharu. All these people who were converted or redeemed or freed. So what's the case here? My love, is it not the case that belinhu al dat beitin? If this child converted at the age of 2.5, is it not the case that they converted through the authority of the courts? Lo, hacha in the Mishnah, b'mayas kinan. What's the case of the Mishnah? Meaning, when I first read Rav Huna, I presented it to James as though it's a particular comment on our Mishnah. How did this kid become Jewish? Through the authority of the Beit Din. The Gemara says, so shouldn't our Mishnah be really working within the operative principle of Rav Huna? It's the Beit Din? No, it's not the Beit Din. What is the authority? What's the mechanism that gets the kid to be Jewish? Beger shenitgayer banav uvenotav imo. A convert who comes and their children, here boys and girls, are converting with him. Here it only mentions the father, which is going to get Rashi in trouble. But let's assume we're talking about a whole family. Because what's happening there? The kids are happy with or comfortable with b'mai da'aved avuhon, that which their parents will ultimately do. Meaning, in a case in which a whole family comes to convert, what's stepping in for the place of the intellect of the kid is not the court, it's the parents. And kids, we hope, want to behave in accordance with their parents' values. So here we have two separate models. Yeah, Bert?
And is David raising his hand? Are you raising your hand, or are you just...
Is that a hand or a stretch?
Right. David, you need to unmute.
No, I think he was just stretching. Were you stretching?
Oh, stretching. Okay, fine. Okay. Oh, you need to unmute if you want to talk, David. We can't hear you.
I don't believe I did anything.
Oh, okay.
We saw your hands moving. It's all good.
Okay.
So the Gemara here, in sort of introducing Rav Huna and then putting Rav Huna in conversation with the Mishnah, introduces two mechanisms for how someone becomes Jewish. Mechanism number one is dat Beit Din, the authority of the court. Mechanism number two is nicha lehu b'may da'aved avuhon, the authority, as it were, of the parent. And it seems like now they're talking about two very different cases. The case of the Mishnah, the Gioret who converted under the age of 3, was with the parents, which implies the case of Rav Huna, there's no parents. So then one has to wonder, what's going on? Is a 2-year-old just showing up in court and saying, "Hi, I want to be Jewish," or a 5-year-old? Like, what is this case? It's the Rishonim are going to be bothered by all of that, as should all of us. Like, what does the Gemara think is going on? If in the Mishnah, it's a family, so the 2-year-old comes with the parents. In Rav Huna's case, maybe the kid's more than 3, maybe the kid's 10. If you're describing a 10-year-old walking into a Jewish court and saying, "Hi, I'd like to be Jewish," is that really what Rav Huna is imagining? What's going on here? Okay, I'm not answering that question now. I'm just putting it out there. So that's kind of conceptual question number 1. What's the mechanism? We have 2 mechanisms. If a family converts, the mechanism is the authority of the parents. If the whole family is not converting, if a kid is converting, but not the parents, which, by the way, is typically the case of adoptions, most adoption cases, then the authority is the authority of the court. Okay. That's issue number 1. What about the ruling? We're now going to get to the rule of Rav Yosef, page number 6. Again, I'm going to read in the Hebrew. The English is right below. Okay, so page number 6 in the Hebrew, the English is right beneath it. So now Rav Yosef introduces another idea. He says, Amar Rav Yosef, Higdilo, once this child becomes 12 or 13, Yicholin limchot. The child has the authority to say, "No thanks," which is scary to imagine, but in theory, one of the jobs of the rabbi, Judy, as you asked, is to actually have a conversation with a child who converted as a baby before their bar bat mitzvah and say, "Do you want to be Jewish?" Now, the goal of the family until that point in time is to make sure that when that pre-teenager or a teenager at the age of 12 or 13 is asked, "Do you want to be Jewish?" that the kid responds in good child fashion and rolls their eyes at the rabbi or at the parent and says, "What are you talking about? Of course I want to be Jewish." That's the right response to that question. It's the only time where I hope that a child rolls their eyes at me is when I have that conversation. As we'll also see, it may be that you don't have to have that conversation. Maybe just once the kid has a bar mitzvah, gets an aliyah, does a mitzvah, gives a devar Torah, they're just sort of implicitly accepting what the parents have done for them. Okay, so that's the goal, is to make sure, but by the child reaches the age of mitzvot, that they're kind of bought into Jewish life. That's the parenting. Yeah.
Are we assuming, since the parents are in essence responsible for the children, they're not responsible for themselves, they're accepting, both the positive and onuses of the thing of doing mitzvahs?
Yeah, in theory. In theory.
Right. In other words, we say, that, so in essence, they're saying we're willing to accept the mitzvos, or the averot of the child. Is that more or less accurate?
Yeah, that's true for every parent of every child, right? Baruch Sheftarani.
Right.
The parent gets all.
Which I always had problems with. Okay.
But it's the same. With everything it is for a born Jew, it's the same here. Parent gets the good and the bad. Okay, so the Gemara says, wait a second. What does it mean to say that the child can back out? Because there's also a possibility of, let's say we have, there's going to be a gap here of time. Let's say a child is converted at the age of 10, and then is engaged to be married. Not very pleasant, but again, in the ancient world that wasn't so uncommon. Is engaged to be married, so they get a ketubah of 200, and then at their bat mitzvah, the kid says, "I don't want to be Jewish." So how does this work? At what stage is the kid no longer considered to be Jewish? We have a possibility of retroactive undoing of a conversion, but there was already a relationship built on that conversion. So how does all this work? So the Gemara says, Eitive Abaye asks to Rav Yosef, based on our Mishnah again, Hagioret v'hashvuya v'hashivcha sheniftu v'shenivgayu v'shenishtachur are 3 women who have been redeemed or converted or freed. Kotod bibalot shlosh shanim b'yom echad ktubatan ma'atayim. So it doesn't have to be a convert. It could just be a girl who's, God forbid, taken captive at the age of 2, and now she gets a ketubah of 200. V'isal kadaitach, and if you were to say that when they have reached the age of majority, higedilu yecholin limchot, what Rav Yosef says, that when they become 12, I guess, she could say, I'm not interested. Yahavinan la ktuba de azla ve'achla begiyuta. So what's going on here? The way the ketubah works, the ketubah is actually a kind of a halachic prenuptial agreement. We don't usually think about it. It's not a very particularly romantic document, almost at all. The ketubah is basically a commitment from the husband that says that if we get divorced, I'm going to pay you a certain amount of money to make sure that you can live on your own. And that number, the amount of money is based on the virginal status of this young girl. So, and the ketubah is basically in halacha viewed as a lien. So when a woman is engaged or married, she has a lien on her husband's property for the amount of the ketubah. Let's call it $200 of a lien. And she can, in theory, use that lien. She can engage with that lien. It's actually a debt that he owes her if they were to ultimately get divorced. But on the one hand, it could be a $200 lien, or it could alternatively be a different kind of a lien. So how does this girl, who let's say converted at the age of 2 and got engaged at the age of 11, which wasn't unheard of in the ancient world, how does she relate to her ketubah? Lechi gadla, the azla va'achla b'giyuta. If she at the age of 11 now wants to spend her lien, right? If you have a debt, if somebody owes you basically $200, you could sell the rights to that debt, right? They're all sort of ways in which the ketubah is viewed as a kind of basically financial instrument. Again, not particularly romantic, but it's a financial document. So let's say she's going to consume the rights to her ketubah between the ages of 11 and 12. And then at the age 12, she says, I don't really want to be Jewish anymore. Now, not only is her ketubah not 200, but they're not even married anymore, right? Because a Jew and a non-Jew, there's no halachic kiddushin, there's no marriage there. So says the Gemara, we have to, if in fact a girl converted at the age of 2 and then got married or engaged at the age of 11, she is not allowed to use the lien of the ketubah until she has reached the age of 12. Lechi gadla. Once she has become 12 years old. The Gemara then asks, Lechi gadla nami memachya v'nafka? But maybe at the age of 12, she says, I want to be Jewish. What happens at the age of 15? She says, you know what? I don't like this whole thing that my parents did for me when I was 2 years old. I don't want to be Jewish anymore. You can't do that, says the Gemara. Kevan shehigdila sha'a achat v'lo michata, since she has, for one moment, sha'a here doesn't mean an hour, but a moment, she has reached the age of 12 and she hasn't rejected what her parents have done for her. Shuv eina yichola limchot. She can't back out of it any longer. Meaning there's a one-time opportunity this young kid has at some point immediately around the context and framework of her conversion, of her reaching the age of 12, she can say, I don't want to be Jewish. But if she has reached the age of 12 and done something Jewish, one of my teachers once said she kissed the mezuzah on the way out of the door, there's no backseats anymore. It's fully finished and sealed. Yeah, Bert?
Okay, I'm somewhat perplexed. She doesn't have to do this renunciation in front of Besdin. And the other thing is, it happens automatically if she turns 12 while she's asleep, and in other words, automatically. In other words, doesn't the issue have to be raised to her as opposed to saying, it automatically happens? I just have trouble with that.
Well, it doesn't have to be in front of a Beit Din, and it doesn't happen when you're sleeping. So usually, what I have done when I was have a relationship with a kid when they convert, the day before their bar mitzvah, I have a meeting with them and I say, listen, your parents converted you or you remember converting as a kid, and according to Jewish law, you have the right to say I don't want to be Jewish anymore. I have never heard of an instance in which a kid said I don't want to be Jewish.
No. What I'm saying though is the way it used to work is how did it work? You say that this is what you usually do. What is the procedure that is generally used?
Some version of what I just described. You have a conversation right before the bar mitzvah.
Okay.
And then basically what you say to them, tomorrow morning you're gonna wake up as a bar or a bat mitzvah, and you're gonna like make a bracha or wash your hands in the morning, and that will be your sort of formal, official accepting of the gift that your parents gave you of being Jewish. That's the way it works. It has to be something active. I don't think passive is enough, but yeah, any active engagement with a Jewish minhag, mitzvah, behavior is the way of this kid saying, I want to be fully Jewish.
There's
Okay.
no bracha that a person makes when he becomes a ger or a gerah.
There's when an adult converts, they say Asher Hashem Tivanu al hatfila or al tfilat ger. Actually, they say minors don't make a bracha. If the whole family converts, the parents could make a bracha for the kids, but usually it's not that way, and then there's no bracha. So I'm going to finish us off with two stories. 10 years, no more than that. Probably 15 years ago, when I was still in the shul in Kesher in Tenafly, New Jersey, Rabbi Riskin had a great idea. His idea was to convert every baby born to one Jewish parent, mother or father, before the age of 10, to go around America and literally convert every single child born as a way to avoid the problem of patrilineality. Because we're getting to a point now, maybe already there, where there are 3 or even 4 generations of patrilineally descended kind of Reform Jews, for whom knowing their status in terms of their Jewish status is actually very, very difficult. And it's a painful question that nobody really wants to talk about. But we're living at a time now where patrilineality has basically been functioning for long enough that there are kids in their 20s who could have grandparents who were themselves patrilineally descended, and therefore they have no idea. What that means is a scary thought. But Sarai Riskin, in an attempt to solve this problem, decided that he actually wanted to meet with the heads of the movements of America and arrange for the conversion of every baby born. And he asked me if I would sit on the Beit Din. That's in my Riskin, what are you, crazy? So I did have a long conversation when I put him in touch with somebody at JTS. And the head of JTS turns him and says to him, what are you talking about, Riskin? All of the children born in my community are Jewish. I don't care what you think. So it didn't go anywhere. But it is a way to deal with some of the more complex problems, because many poskim, as we'll see, assume that when the parents are present, the halachic observance of the family system is irrelevant. Meaning, if the child is going to convert, the other way around, if the child is going to convert through the da'at of the Beit Din, through the authority of the rabbis, so then as long as they're the rabbis, as long as the rabbis say that they're Jewish, it sort of makes them Jewish because zechut hu lo. And that's really an interesting possibility. And in Israel, that's one of the recommendations for dealing with the contemporary challenge of the Aliyah from the former Soviet Union, is to convert all the kids and not necessarily deal with the adults. It's kind of a way to get around a set of issues where many assume that the conversion of minors is more lenient, and it's a way to address a problem without having to go at it head on. So I don't have to deal with the conversion of the adults, I have to deal with only the conversion of the children. That's one way in which this material becomes very, very important in the 21st century. I'll also just share, which Bert sort of hinted to, for about 13 years now, I've been involved with the conversion of families coming from Israel with 2 dads who are doing surrogacy and adoption in this country. And it's sort of a fascinating experience where typically it's that one of the members of the couple is Dati, one is sort of less Dati, Masorti, or even Kiloni, but the home is kosher, they are Shomer Shabbat in meaningful ways, and it's 2 dads living together. And I've now converted nearly 40 babies in the last 13, 14 years, like this. And what I do is sort of address the question of the ongoing kind of maturity of these young kids is that I make connections with their local rabbis in their communities, so that there's somebody kind of on site, as it were, who can serve as the family's rabbi when they have questions. And sometimes they reach out to me, but typically like I'm sort of performing a function, and then they're going to go back to their home community. And so these two dads come to this country. They do surrogacy in some clinic someplace in North America, United States, in part because Israel, Medinat Israel, won't allow two dads to do surrogacy and adoption. America does. And they do there are clinics all over the states that do this. There are conventions in Israel where clinics go to Israel and they try to find couples. There's like a whole network of this. And it's quite amazing. And these young men are like serious, committed Jews in one way or another who are trying to build their families. And one of the fascinating pieces is almost always it's a non-Jewish egg and a non-Jewish host, which is good kind of for the gene pool. Also clarifies the identity. Once in a while, someone seeks out a Jewish egg. It's very, very difficult to find a Jewish host. Very rare. Most of the women who serve as hosts are actually religious Christians, for whom this is like the greatest chesed they can do. And it's interesting when a religious, like a serious evangelical woman is having a baby for a gay couple. That's like a complicated reality. But it is interesting to sort of, and they meet the woman, they usually meet the host, spend some time with her. They're often there in the hospital room when the baby is born, and they maintain a relationship for some period of time. Often that relationship wanes over the matter of months or years. But these women are like tzaddikim, they're non-Jews who just want to help people who can't have kids. And it's like amazing to see. And so that was that process already for 13 years ago is part of what kind of got me started thinking about and learning about and ultimately teaching about the question of converting minors. And so some of the stuff that you'll hear eventually will come back to those issues as we go forward. Any other last minute questions? So what I'll do is next week again, probably on Sunday, I'll send you the source material, and I'll also put a link in the classroom so that everybody can have it. The shul is going to take the recordings and it's going to be on the shul's website. I actually don't know where those things live. I guess there must be an archive somewhere. And thank you, Bert, again for making it happen.
Thank you, Bert.
Thank
and
you.
Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank you. Have
Thank
a
you.
good day.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you very much. Thank you.